Tonight, we're still trying to make sense of last night's deadly mid-air collision at Reagan National Airport. We know it only took a split second for things to go wrong.
Yeah, we want to play some of the audio from air traffic control in the seconds after that crash. And we do have to warn you, this clip includes video that is really hard to watch.
I just saw a fireball and then it was just gone. So I haven't seen anything since they hit the river, but it was a CRJ and a helicopter that hit. I would say maybe a half-mile off the approach end of 33.
Is the airfield closed?
Yes, the airfield is closed. The airfield is closed.
Runways as well?
Yes, all runways are closed. Nobody's landing. No one's moving at all.
We wanted to get a better idea of what it's like to be in that tower faced with such a high-stress job. So we've brought in leading expert Todd Yeary, who is a former FAA Certified Professional Controller. Thank you for being here with us.
Thanks for having me, unfortunately, under these circumstances.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, you understand the challenges and the complexities that controllers face every day. Take us into what that's like.
Well, what it's like is every day is unique unto itself. You come in with an anticipation that there's a certain order, certain flow to what happens in your facility because you're accustomed to the schedule, the number of flights, how they normally move, but then there's a dynamic portion to it that is often unscripted and unpredictable. Things like weather that often come up without warning, that could drastically change how you respond to what is otherwise a routine day. Issues like equipment malfunctions, what happens when things beyond your control, like we saw on 9/11, that automatically an event in New York changes the entire system in real time.
And you were there on 9/11.
I was there. I worked in Chicago that day. I remember that day when we were quite honestly forcing commercial aircraft to the nearest airplane, and they could either land with an escort or without one. But it was just that serious. And when you don't really know what's going on, all you have are the tools and the rules, right? The tools of the trade being the radio frequency, the lessons that you've learned, the skills that you've developed to be able to respond to situations that you didn't anticipate, and there is no book for it.
Yeah. Let's talk about last night, because the Associated Press is reporting that there was one person working and doing two jobs in that air traffic control tower there at Reagan. One person typically oversees the helicopters, one person oversees the planes. Does that sound plausible?
It sounds plausible simply because there are a number of factors that go into staffing. The air traffic day is kind of like an accordion. It expands and contracts based on demand and need. And so your staffing will start relatively low early in the day, it will peak at a point, and then it will gradually scale back until you get to the later parts of the day. And so in my own experience, it was not uncommon to work a combined sector, what we would call it, and later in the night, as I would often work third shift, sometimes we would combine multiple sectors into one simply because there was no demand. It allowed us to preserve and reserve resources when we actually needed them, and it didn't compromise the safety. So the mere fact that these positions may have been combined does not necessarily say to me that that was in and of itself a safety issue. What is a bigger concern based on what I've seen is whether or not the proximity of the aircraft, one on final approach, one that's transiting around the airspace, what were the instructions given? Was there information given that made one or the other or both of them aware that they were in the same general vicinity, and were those instructions in that advisement, were those acknowledged?
You've had an opportunity to listen to some of the audio and to see what little video we've been able to see of that tragic moment midair. What do you think occurred as someone who has directed air traffic in and out of airplanes for decades?
Yeah, so in Chicago, it's often controlled airspace where the control towers and the approach controls are actually staffed. Late at night, some air traffic control towers actually shut down, and so it's the regional center that controls from the ground all the way up to the ceiling of the National Airspace System. What I think, I don't know what happened. Let me give you a better sense of what I would raise as questions. Question number one is for any aircraft, whether it is rotor or fixed wing, when they're in that proximity, very often we do what we call calling traffic. was traffic call. That means simply because they're in proximity and one may have equipment, they may not be, the pilots, the crew may not be paying as close attention to what's going on around them because they have things that they're focusing on the flight deck. So I believe traffic would have been called. As a matter of fact, the bit of radio transmission to the military helicopter asked, do you have the CRJ in sight? That says to me that traffic
Can you see that jet?
Can you see that jet? That says before that, there was probably an advisory that says, Pat 25, you have traffic at a position, at an altitude, this is the direction it's moving, do you have it in sight? If you have it in sight, maintain what we call visual separation from that traffic, and then you can kind of proceed on course. That's kind of the question that I initially have as to the instruction and the advisory that was given. Was it heard? Was it understood? Now, here's the caveat. Having flown on the flight deck and observed flight crews, when you're flying at night particularly, you don't see airplanes the way you and I would expect to see airplanes when we get on them at airports. If these airplanes are against a dark sky, challenging ground lights, what you're really looking for is not so much the physical attributes, but can you see the beacon, the flashing light that goes on top, that little red thing that goes on or at the bottom. And so if you pick up the beacon, can you distinguish the beacon from other lights, residual lights that are coming from the ground? And can you keep it in your sights? Because remember, it's not just stationary. This airplane's moving. So the CRJ, depending on what its landing profile was, could have been moving at a speed of about 130 knots just before it gets ready to touch down. We don't know what the speed profile was of the helicopter, right? So once I see it, I've got to see it and track it. But if I'm seeing it and tracking it, can I then observe and pay attention to everything else I have to do with the flight controls? So there are a number of dynamic realities that we cannot capture in a soundbite or in a clip, which is why the role of the NTSB and all of the subject matter experts is so critical to help us understand what's happened.
Yeah, you're talking about these dynamic realities here, and we think of this airspace in particular, which is extremely unique. You have hundreds of flights going in and out of Reagan National Airport every day. You have these military helicopters flying over the district at all hours of the day as well. So for these air traffic controllers, this is sort of a delicate dance all day.
I think dance is right. It's a choreography that is often impacted by circumstance. Now, I've looked at a couple of tracks of the movement. I'm not sure if maybe the helicopter took an early turn on course, if it veered off course, we don't know, right? So this isn't about assigning a blame one way or the other. It's really kind of understanding what's going on at that moment that led to the catastrophic outcome that now has 67 people lost and their families grieving, and the rest of us raising a lot of questions.
We have talked, as we have tried to contextualize what happened yesterday, and it's still so fresh. It's been about a day, really, since this happened. And one of the points of conversation that we've heard come up, and you know this from your many years of being an air traffic controller, is that there simply aren't enough of you. And how much of a role that might have played leading up to what happened yesterday, or not?
Well, I think it's always a factor that you consider sufficient resources, particularly staffing, right? Air traffic control is not one of those vocations that you pass off to some virtual reality. That's not how it works. The other part is to understand the history of how we even got here. Part of my own story is remembering that when I hired into the agency, I was part of one of the last cohorts that was being hired to fill the losses that were tied to the firing of the controllers after the PATCO strike. So you have a large number of your workforce of about 14,000 controllers that are really hired within a window of about a decade. Let's just call it about 10 years. You add 25 years to that. You have to hire before you're 31. You can retire after 25 years. You have to retire at 56.
So no more directing traffic after 56.
You cannot control live traffic.
Interesting.
After 56. So your 56th birthday, you're done with live traffic. Now you may do administrative duties or something else, but moving live traffic is not what you do. So when you look at that, you have that same cohort, that period of a decade hiring after the PATCO strike in 81, you had 25 years, give or take. So if I hired in almost 1990, so you got 2015, depending on the age. We've got a number of losses that are going to be successive year after year, either by mandatory retirement or the increasing gap, because you don't just hire a controller today and put them in a position tomorrow. It took, and I think I was on the short end of the average training time at Chicago Center. It took me 3.5 years from the time I got to the facility to the time that I was fully certified. So it takes some time. You've got to add the time to go through the administration of the test, the staffing of the screen classes in Oklahoma City, the assignment to the facilities based on their individual needs, the training time that's required to get them through that unique training scenario for wherever they're assigned, Reagan being unique to, say, LaGuardia being unique. There's some general principles, but the airport layouts are different. And so I think there is an oversimplification that has imposed itself on this tragedy that says that we want to give sound bites and milquetoast responses to what is really a much more complicated scenario. And we also have to remember that the last midair collision before last night was 1978. So it's not, the safest system always has vulnerabilities, right? We learned that last night. We knew that before last night. It was just brought to our awareness in a much more urgent sort of way. How we respond to it is the way that we go about making sure that we don't have a repeat of what happened last night, right? And so I think that's the big takeaway that I have from what I've seen over the last 24 hours.
And you mentioned the job has been simplified to a degree. You know, we see that air traffic control tower, and most folks don't know what's going on in there. So what is needed for this job? I think you look at the images, you see the radar screen in front of the person who might be working at the time, but folks really don't understand what the job entails, clearly.
Well, it takes good training. It takes the ability to respond emotionally, cognitively, psychologically, on a dime. It requires the ability to be able to live in the crucible of an adrenaline rush that ebbs and flows.
You're like our first responders in the sky, essentially.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's a perfect analogy to it. Add to it that the first responders in the sky, even when it's routine, it's pressure filled, right? Even on a clear night, when you can see the stars, if you just go back and listen to what happened in the moments right after the crash occurred, you hear the transmission of someone from the control tower relaying to the emergency team, this is what happened, this is what the aircraft that were involved, this was the position. If you listen to that voice is pretty much calm.
Very calm, yeah.
Very calm, very clear, because what has to be communicated cannot get lost in transmission. And so I think a lot of times folks who've never been in a tower cab, never been in a radar room, never sat on a flight deck to understand the nuances of what happens in real time, they provide commentary to things that they don't really understand.
Can you help us understand what we have been talking about quite a bit, which is near misses that have occurred at Reagan National? And again, we are still waiting to get all of the details about what happened yesterday, so this is not a pontification about that. But since we're talking about it, and we know that this has been an issue at a crowded and very dense Reagan National Airport, how does one avoid that as a controller?
Well, one, we got to be clear on what we're talking about with a near miss, right? So a near miss is a category of a loss of acceptable separation between aircraft. Are these near misses on the ground? If they're on the ground, are they on an active taxiway? Is it on a runway? Is it in what we often call the alley where the gates are, right? So a lot of it is, what is the information that informs why we're calling this a near miss? What are the factors, the factual understandings that go there? But to the point, here's what has happened. After 9/11, the air traffic control system shut down, literally. I remember working that day as Air Force One left Offutt Air Force Base. President Bush was in Florida that morning. He went to Omaha. He was in the bunker. He left Omaha to get to DC because he wanted to speak to the nation. I was working that afternoon when that flight passed through the area that I was assigned to. I was a manual controller. A colleague of mine was working on the radar. There were military aircraft that were running their routine operations that Air Force One did not really even know. They don't even know that these operations go on. And when they looked at the radar on the plane, asking, what are those planes out there? And we told them those were military aircraft. The captain of Air Force One told us, move them. Right? So when we think about this notion of near misses and what's needed and what's required and where are we have to remember to a great degree, you've got air traffic control personnel, you've got airline personnel, you've got support company personnel, you've got vehicles moving on the surface, you've got food service trucks moving between planes, you've got baggage cars moving back and forth to get bags from the planes, you've got fuel trucks moving between gates to fuel the planes. We cannot in this moment, especially with this tremendous loss of life, almost 50 years since the last major mid-air crash in this country, we cannot oversimplify what we think has happened in this moment. We owe it to the memories of the 67 people, many of them young people who were pursuing their dreams, right? Life had not really yet met them in the fullness of its expression. We cannot make this analysis on the cheap. We've got to take time and understand what happened. Were our anticipated procedures that we've used for a while, do they need to be updated, modified? Was there some deviation from that informed what took place that contributed to the crash? Was there a mechanical issue? Was there an issue of personnel? It is too easy to gravitate to what we think might appease the curiosity of folks this soon after such a tragedy. But I go back and I think I found some comfort in the NTSB presser that you'll get a preliminary report in about 30 days.
Right.
And then it'll take some time to get the rest of the information.
So while we wait for that information, based on what you've seen so far and based on your experience, what do you think needs to change right away in this particular airspace? Is there anything that stands out, any sort of red flags?
Short answer is I don't know.
Okay.
Right? It starts with evaluating what's there. Right? Start with what you do know. You had procedures in place, were they followed? You had staffing in place, was it sufficient? Were there other things that could have been done? I don't think you can make recommendations in the blind without having sufficient information to make informed decisions. Otherwise, I think we set ourselves up for a future disappointment, and it may not take as long as the last 45 years to get there.
Before we let you go, you come from a family of aviators and controllers. You learned at the foot of your father, you watched your stepmother do this, you then pursued it as a career. Is this still a career worth seeking for future controllers who have an interest in aviation and people and passengers?
I'm biased. Once you find out what air traffic control is, if you get a taste of it, you never get it out of your system. It is by far the most fun, rewarding job I have ever had. Although I've had some pretty
Even
rewarding
in a pressure cooker environment?
Well, you know,
that's a lot of pressure on you.
It is a lot of pressure, and I didn't realize how much pressure until I was no longer doing it. But when you're doing it, because of what it means, think about it. There were people trying to get to their loved ones last night. There were professionals trying to help them accomplish that. There were military personnel trying to prepare their skills to defend what affects all of us. And in the background were some faithful controllers trying to help make that happen. And so every day it happens. While we go to sleep tonight, there'll be red-eye flights and what we call box haulers moving our packages and promoting commerce and all of that. And when we wake up in the morning, short of there being some notice that something different has happened, we will just take it in stride and keep on moving. This is amongst the most rewarding careers you can have. It's not meant for everybody, but once you explore it, I promise you, if you're good at it, you'll love it.
Making those important connections.
Todd Yeary, respected expert in air control and a pastor. There's something to this. We thank you for your time and your talent today.
Thanks for the word.
Glad I could contribute. Thank you so much.